Even so, McClendon doesn't want us to leave behind uh, the body then and simply try to go to a realm of pure reason. And so he looks then in the rest of this chapter for different doors, different windows perhaps into how we might learn from our bodily existence about what the life of the Christian ought to be. So he introduces, for instance, three terms together: needs and goods and rights. Now, needs are a concept that we're quite familiar with. Of course, they don't escape cultural influence, but they do speak to certain aspects of our existence that, as best we can tell, require us to be able to receive these, to have these needs met in order to flourish, and in many cases in order even to survive. And so obvious needs for nutrition, for hydration, needs for rest, needs for affiliation with others. These needs can play a role in our thinking about the ethical life. If it's true that, as we believe from our theological convictions, that God created us to live together in our social existence, and that life is good in God's eyes, then making sure that people have what they need to live would be an important part of our ethical reasoning. To move on quickly, needs in a certain way correspond like a mirror image to the concept of goods. Goods are those, they can be material things, they can be more abstract things that are what we aim for in our lives, what we believe is important in life. We talk about goods and services, like commodities. And so goods can be commodities, and then they may not all be completely commodifiable. And so goods could be food. Goods could be water. Goods could also be health. Goods could be peace. And so what are the goods that human beings seek? This is related to our teleological nature, that we aim for. We seek certain goods. The ultimate good, the highest good, is to love God and one another. But then there are, as we saw with Bonhoeffer, penultimate goods or proximate goods. Proximate means nearby. Penultimate means on the way toward the ultimate. And so the good of food is a penultimate good because in the sharing of food and the enjoyment of food, we get some glimpse, some part of what we were made to do and be. And it also enables us and gives us the strength to do those other things that we were made to do. And so there are penultimate and proximate goods that we don't confuse with the ultimate good. And then, and so there are many goods, and as we'll talk about later in the course, goods are a central concept to talking about practices. Finally, he brings up rights. McClendon is less enthusiastic about the concept of rights for helping us in ethics, because rights already is implying a highly individualistic understanding of human beings. That is, if I have a right, then it's mine. And so rights have built into them a kind of conflictual relationship between myself and yourself. as we, in a sense, bring up the concept of right because of a conflict that has emerged between us over some goods, over some need. Now, on the other hand, the concept of rights as a pragmatic tool has been a very powerful one in recent centuries. And so we don't want to belittle the significance of talking about voting rights, of talking about other forms of human rights in order to persuade governments and legislatures and powerful groups to create more equity in society. But in many ways, the concept of rights helps us to battle through a problem, but it doesn't help us sustain life and community in a way that creates the kind of beloved community that we would most aim for. Okay, let's move ahead to the next section, number 7. He talks about native moral capacities. And so what we see there in several of those cases are what might in other ethics textbooks be referred to as human passions or human emotions. He identifies 2 central passions, delight and horror. Delight being that joyfulness, that we're drawn to something. Horror being what we push away, what we abhor, what we despise, what makes us sick, what makes us afraid. And so he's saying we have within us these capacities to delight and to be horrified. And those are part of how we're made. Now the question is, what are we going to attach them to? And so do we delight too much in things that aren't important? Or do we become numb and no longer horrified by things that ought to disturb us? So delight and horror are closely related to virtue ethics in that part of what virtue is the training of our emotions so that we will love what we ought to love and hate what we ought to hate. We'll delight in what ought to delight us, and we will be horrified by what should be horrible. And so delight and horror are those capacities within us, these emotional capacities, which they have some instinctual ability. And yet, to grow into maturity, they also have to be formed and shaped, because there are many shaping forces which might urge us, in fact, to delight in things that we ought not to delight in. Then shame, blame, and guilt. These are all also related to our emotions, to our passions, and they have to do with our sense that there is something that's right and there is something that's wrong, and our relationship to it. And so shame, as Aristotle calls it, a kind of a half virtue, because it doesn't seem to be, it would be bad not to have any. It doesn't seem to be an immediate good that comes out of it, but our sense of shame that we have done wrong, that we're unworthy, that we are less than we ought to be, is part of our makeup. And as we understand it theologically, it ought then to drive us toward some resolution. Similarly, blame as our recognition that when things are wrong, it's often because of what someone has done. And so whether we blame ourselves or we blame someone else, what we're recognizing is moral wrong, and that there are agents of moral wrong. And this is part of the broad makeup of all humanity, is this recognition of acts that can be blameworthy, or in contrast, praiseworthy. And finally, guilt, which has multiple meanings. It can be guilt as an emotion, which is sort of like shame, or it can be guilt as a matter of naming and recognizing the cause of evil, and so the judgment that someone is guilty of a certain act um, is related as well to our sense of guilt and remorse that ought to grow from that. Well, these are some of the aspects of our native moral capacities, of our basic moral equipment that McClendon wants us to take note of, and we'll discuss as we discuss virtues. Perhaps we'll be able to make clearer how what he's arguing is related to the larger concepts of virtue ethics.